This is one of the things that really surprised me when I was working on this story. DeepSeek had spent a lot of time last year retrofitting their models and software with Huawei chips. I think a lot of people assumed it's because the government ordered DeepSeek to work with Huawei to embrace the domestic ecosystem, but it's actually the opposite. It was DeepSeek that voluntarily started using Huawei, experimenting with Huawei chips. And Huawei actually only found out after then they start sending people to DeepSeek to help them.
Welcome to Analyse podcast, the premier podcast dedicated to dissecting the pulse of business, technology, and media globally. I'm Bernard Liang, and the last time we spoke, the story was Chinese AI startups going global. Since then, the map has shifted. DeepSeek has raised more than $7.4 billion in its first external funding round, valuing the company at more than $50 billion. Meanwhile, Junyang Lin, the former lead researcher on Alibaba's Qwen models, has launched a new AI lab that has reportedly completed its first fundraising round at a post-money valuation of around $2 billion USD. These stories raise a bigger question. How is China building their frontier AI under cheap constraints, state capital, open source ambition, and scarce elite talent? With me today is Jing Yang, Asia Bureau Chief at The Information, who has been reporting these stories from Hong Kong, and I think she'll probably go into China all the time. So, Jing Yang, welcome back.
Thank you for having me again. Just for the purpose of, legal compliance, no, I don't go to China all the time.
Really? Okay, now just joking. All right. Hey, since we last spoken, we were in studio together. What have you been up to since we last spoke?
I was actually reviewing our last conversation because that was in September, I believe, last year, and so much has changed. The one thing that I think, not really a correction, but if you recall, we talked about how we don't know what ByteDance is up to and how they stopped participating in the AI model leaderboard, and then they also haven't had at the time open source any of their big models, and it's a bit of a mystery. But then now we all know that, with C-downs making waves and controversies, we know what they're doing. So yeah, I guess this is a way of saying, I mean, we all know that with development AI in today's age, everything is developing and iterating in such an unprecedented pace. I definitely struggle to follow and make sense of things. And I don't know about you. If you have any tips, I'd like to hear about them.
I feel like every few days there's a change, and I am not surprised anymore by any changes. In fact, when SeedDance came out, until today, I think we can't even use API on SeedDance. You actually have to basically subscribe to their models as a consumer user. And I think you have another model called Lumia. But if you look at the leaderboard, SeedDance is now number one, followed by Google's 3.5 models now, I think, if I'm not wrong. But yeah, so I think this whole space is really moving so fast. I used to think that China AI is like every once a time they make an announcement, it will shock everybody. So that's why I got you here today to help our audience to understand how China's ecosystems is developing on its own terms, not just simply as a reaction to the US, but as a distinct model of frontier AI development shaped by their talent, open weight models, chips, capital, and developer adoption. And of course, UB Tech is going to launch their first humanoid robots. And we know this is where this is all going towards. So I want to first start off having this conversation about DeepSeek, because this is the most interesting company ever. So earlier, it was seen as a capital efficient research outlier, a lab funded by Liang Wenfeng and Highflyer, known for pushing frontier performance with unusually efficient model design. And usually when people ask me, where should I learn all the tricks to do open source AI? I think you should just go to DeepSeek's GitHub repository. Actually, they just let out so many things that people just don't know. So now the reports is that DeepSeek has raised more than $7.4 billion in its first external financing round, valuing the company at more than $50 billion and making it now, I think, China's most valuable AI startup. If I'm correct, maybe something has changed today. So how should we understand DeepSeek's evolution from a highly efficient research lab into now one of the most closely watched AI companies in China and globally?
Yeah, that's quite a big question you have there for me. But let's try to break it down piece by piece. When we were the first to report that DeepSeek was doing fundraising for the first time ever, and that was in mid-April. I still remember vividly that it was a Friday night. I think one of the reporters on my team, Chen Liu, she got the first tip, and it was around 8 p.m. I was going to just wind down and start my weekend. And obviously, then there's Chenna, me, and Juro, the three of us. We quickly mobilize and try to reach out to sources and people we think who might know this. And I think within an hour and a half, we had the story out. But while in all of that hustle, I was basically reporting the story and writing the story in sort of in the state of huge disbelief. You know how, like, as a journalist, when you're covering something that is breaking, you have to like put your own personal feelings and opinions aside and just like try to like get the news out first. So in the ensuing 2 months, we covered very closely almost every major step of the way with the fundraising, and we saw how the valuation started to multiply, going up higher because our initial story said that they were just seeking like a probably a 10 sorry, excuse me, like they're seeking to raise about $300 million at a $10 billion value, 10 billion
Yeah.
plus valuation, which was considered quite low, and then quickly became 20, and then quickly now we know how much it is, right? It is 50. But along the way, I think maybe during this, and then we were the first to report the closing as well. And what hit me was the closing was this really unusual deal structure. I have been covering like VC deals since 2019, back when I was still at the Wall Street Journal. So it's about 7 years. I wouldn't say that's a super long time, but it definitely is not a short amount of time. I've definitely covered a lot of deals as a journalist. And this structure was so strange and so unusual that while I was getting like information on, the different elements of the deal structure, I actually struggled for like about maybe 5 minutes how to make sense of all of it. And when I was drafting the story, because we wanted to get it out as soon as we can, and I need to make sense of all of this. And I actually like the first draft I had was actually pretty not sensible. And it wasn't until like later after I finished writing the whole thing, and then it dawned on me, oh, actually, I should have written it this way. So I then went back to change it. And then the editor who was like editing the story was like, I cannot edit a story if you keep making changes. And I said, I'm sorry, like my brain literally shut down for like 5 minutes because I don't know how to actually make sense of this. That shows you how unusual this is, right? And then and then obviously, I also got a team to like start, including myself, to start, also preparing for like this sort of step back story. Basically, in my vision, I think by the time that we can report the funding has closed, we also need to start right away a story to review the whole process and then review what really what happened behind the scene that made this really notable strategy shift. And so a week later, we had that story. And then we can talk about all of this. But the first thing, I think the whole, 2 months-ish reporting process on this story, I personally just, feel a little bit sad, if that makes sense. I know that nobody cares if I'm sad or not, but I guess my point is maybe as a journalist, sometimes we have some like romantic thinking or idealistic sort of thinking when we look at, the things we cover, right? I think with DeepSeek came out of nowhere to a large part of the world, it came out of nowhere. You know, remember that this is a lab that became famous, became a global superstar for not embracing this, I guess you can call whether it's scaling law pioneered by OpenAI or this endless chase after compute and therefore capital, right? They were like so refreshing, so different from the dominant trend or the path that everybody was on. And for them to be like the holdout to external capital and to this race to secure more compute to scale up. And they were the holdout for like, say almost a year and a half since they, became famous. And if you trace back to when they were founded, then several years. But for that last holdout to also have a change of a course, a complete U-turn, and then embrace what seems like the mainstream way of developing frontier AI models is quite striking. And as someone who's watching this closely from the peanut gallery, I secretly, personally hope that they would not have done that they could stay being this really special lab and existence in the development of frontier AI models. But it looks like, they are going to join. So the
Yeah.
main,
I
yeah.
think one thing you alluded to just now was about the unusual deal structure. You want to talk a little bit about the unusual deal structure that's behind this deal because there's quite a lot to unpack there. Yeah.
Yes, yes. So this is what I will to in order to talk about the structure, I would first categorize the investors in this round into four types. The first one being the CEO Liang himself, who wrote the biggest check, and he wrote two-fifths of the entire fundraising amount. And then the second type would be sort of the corporate VCs, right? The who's who in China's tech land. There's Tencent, JD.com, NetEase, ZATL, etc. And then the third type would be then the typical VC firms, right? IDG Capital and a couple others. Then the fourth type would be China's national artificial. They call it China's National Artificial Intelligence Industry Investment Fund. I just want to make sure I get the name right. So then within these four groups of investors, obviously, Liang is his money and essentially his company, right? I don't think anyone would have anything to say in terms of how he wants to use his money. So
Well, he
let's
put
just
his money where his mouth is, right? He's probably one of the
that.
largest shareholders.
Yeah, I mean, he was before the fundraiser, and then he continues to be, right?
Yeah.
And then so I think we can put that pocket of money aside. We don't care how he uses it. We're in the structure he puts it, right? And then for the second, the corporate VCs, and the third, the typical VCs, they both have to invest their money in a limited partnership, solely created for the purpose of this fundraising. So these two types of investors invest, wired the money into that LP structure, which is managed by Liang himself. And then,
Okay.
so only the National AI Fund, which by the way, you may have heard China's big fund, the big semiconductor fund as one of its anchor investors. That's the relationship between, by the way, the China AI Fund and the big fund. So only the China AI Fund can invest in DeepSeek's corporate entity directly. And then for the type 2 and type 3 investors, they have to invest in this LP. And what this means is that basically they will not have any voting rights because you are not investing in the company that you are funding, right? So basically all the voting rights are still like controlled by the GP of that LP structure, which is Liang himself. Right? And then also they all have to agree to a 5-year lockup period. I think the one of the few exceptions of this lockup would be, let's say DeepSeek goes public within the 5-year period. So what this lockup means really is that you cannot sell your shares to another party, and this is quite unusual, as you know, because in ginormous VC deals, whether it's those raised by ByteDance before or like OpenAI and Anthropic. Usually in these VC deals, you have like the investors investing, but then within this investor, behind them there could be different layers of like SPV setup for other investors to have an opportunity to invest indirectly in the round, and also usually after the round is closed, if you don't want to wait for the IPO exit, if you want to do some profit taking, and then you can sell these shares on the secondary share market. So you see, like, for example, ByteDance's private shares being traded fairly actively throughout all these years on the secondary market. And you would probably, because of this lockup, we probably will not, it's unlikely to see DeepSeek shares being peddled on the secondary market. And as we're reviewing the story, this is all to ensure that this structure is all to ensure that DeepSeek will only attract investors that are in here along for the ride to AGI in the long run, not people who just want a quick gain or a quick exit. And one more thing that is also unusual within this deal structure is that during the deal making process, the company also did, I guess we can call it reverse due diligence on the investors' LPs. So they were adamant that because this is such a hot deal, right? You can imagine a lot of people would want to get in, and there are people who may not have direct access to funding. So then they will be like also pulling together some money and then maybe in a newly established fund and then try to squeeze it in, right? Like a lot of murky sort of arrangement that could happen, which by the way, really again is quite common in large deals, right? However, in this case, DeepSeek was adamant that if you want to invest, it cannot be a new fund. Or a fund that with new LPs, right? So like if I'm letting you this GP to invest in me, that's because I know you and your track record and who your backers are, right? So this is also sort of as an attempt to eliminate sort of some strange actors, unfamiliar faces trying to write on the deal. So then basically they were asked to see like a list of all the LPs
Wow.
that were going to be invest in the fund and then to see who they are and whether they are credible people to really make sure who really owns DeepSeek's shares and if you combine this with this lockup requirement, right? They have this lockup also because they don't want to see at some point, because if private shares get changed hands on the secondary market, oftentimes I think some companies may not know who end up really owning their shares, right? That's exactly why they want to avoid as well.
It's interesting because I think the deal would have come together would take a bit of long time because they have to first do reverse due diligence and then they have to construct such complicated SPVs in order to be able to structure the deal. And the founder is so deeply immersed in it, right? So another way I can frame this is like DeepSeek is trying to balance three things at once. So they have their open source ambition, they want to do long-term AGI research, and then the realities of operating in a pretty strategically important sector where, everybody is going to IPO and then somebody is going to tell him, hey, you should IPO too because Anthropic and OpenAI are going to IPO, right? So from your reporting, how does the founder Liang Wenfeng appear to balance these priorities?
I think obviously I wouldn't claim that I really know him.
But from your perspective, when you look at how DeepSeek has evolved in the last 1.5 years since its rise.
Yeah, so obviously, I think the deal structure tells you a lot on how he's trying to balance that, right? I mean, there is obviously, I mean, the irony is definitely not lost on me. So when his sort of AGI vision is that, AI, any advancements of AI should be made available to all and benefit all, right? I sort of summarize it as AI should be inclusive. However, in order to ensure that you get that goal, you have to actually have a opposite of inclusive kind of deal structure and also really grips the control of the company to have firmly within your hands. This is kind of similar, I think, a similar irony I can think of is that when OpenAI was founded with this, similar ambition, and therefore the name Open in their company's name, then pretty early on realized that we actually cannot open source our technologies because we are so great and so far ahead of everyone else. We cannot afford, our technologies end up in the hands of the wrong people. Therefore, we have to actually close everything. Does the the end just justify these kind of means? I don't know, but I think what I kept thinking while reporting everything I just shared with you is sort of this paralleled irony. I feel like we're in such an unprecedented crazy like era that these kind of ironies are kind of like, I don't know if people talk about it bothers people, but But as someone who's not in AI but watch it from the sideline closely, I can't help but just thinking about these ironies,
There is a Chinese phrase for that.
which is
人在江湖身不由己.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, obviously, I can, it's easy to criticize, right? It's easy to say, oh, you should have done this or that, right? So I'm not saying they should not or should not have done this. I'm just pointing out the irony, right? Whether the ends justify the means they are using, the jury is still out. We'll just have to see.
But I wanted to point to one of your articles after the reporting of the funding. It's about Anthropic's Mythos preview. I think it really changed how Liang Wenfeng's view of what DeepSeek needed. That frontier AI is no longer about efficiency, but about having sufficient capital, compute, and talent to stay in the race. I mean, just look at the last few months. While you're reporting on DeepSeek, you have Andrej Karpathy joining Anthropic. You have John Jumper from Google DeepMind, who's a Nobel Prize winner, also joining Anthropic. What does that actually tell us now in this next phase of the frontier development? I mean, specifically also thinking about from China's perspective. I think a lot of people know what the West perspective look like, but very few people really understand the Chinese side.
Yeah, so we reported that, it was the preview of Mythos in early April that prompted Liang Wenfeng's change of heart and change of strategy. The kind of advancements that Mythos demonstrated made him realize that the scaling law, for lack of a better alternative, still exists and still works and has proven to be working. There was a period of time, I think last year, that people were like not sure if that's still the way to go, right? If you remember. So that sort of like reaffirmed or maybe showed him that yes, scaling, the DeepSeek needs a lot of data and compute. Therefore, that's why they need the capital, right? So it's not just compute, but also data. And then I understand that when we are sort of marveling how how this DeepSeek fundraising and the money they raise and the valuation that they have now is quite a sort of landmark event in China AI. However, I understand, when I was sharing my stories on X, there's also a lot of people saying how this is just tiny compared to what US AI labs have been raising for sure. I mean, the valuation in China, not just in the AI space, but also in the robotic space, if you compare it to the US, are definitely seem super undervalued. I mean, right now, Zhipu is probably the most valuable, right? Around $100 billion dollars in market cap, which is still, a fraction of Anthropic and OpenAI. But I would like to point out, I mean, there's like a whole 3 hour conversation we can have about why there is such a discrepancy in the valuations.
But
But
maybe,
but one thing,
yeah.
the one thing I would point out, which will sort of hopefully answer your question, is that I think a lot of times companies are valued based on expectation, based on their future projection, right? And then there are two things going on here, right? So the enterprise software market in China is just so underdeveloped. I mean, it's gotten a little bit better after, since, there's generative AI wave, but it's still like very underdeveloped. It's still super hard to make money from enterprise customers compared to the US. And by the way, this is a reason why, or one of the reasons why you see a lot of Chinese entrepreneurs when they launch like some kind of agentic product in overseas, they go to the consumer market because very few people in Silicon Valley are doing that because there's already a lot of money to be made to do agentic AI applications serving enterprise customers, while doing something to consumers is considered quite hard in terms of monetization, right? So I think underlying one of the underlying reasons is exactly this. Uh, there's been this sort of like hope among the VCs and the tech people I talk to that hopefully this will change. That hopefully when the technology really advances to a point that Chinese AI model developers and can start sort of like, I don't know, shape the habit of paying for software, paying for services that are value add, shaping, I mean, enterprise customers doing that. I mean, you must know this, right? in China, like everybody's trying to, from the dawn of internet age, right? From like Web 1.0, everybody is trying to find the parity version of a software. I remember growing up using parity version of Microsoft Word. Not that I wouldn't pay. I don't think it's even possible to find like a licensed, version at that time. They were just not sold on the market. This shows you how endemic the problem is. And then to answer your question, I think this is sort of the one thing that I think, this lack of, a a sophisticated enterprise software customer base, customer who are willing to pay, who recognize the usefulness of technology.
But
In
it's a bit
some,
weird from my point of view because okay, I understand why enterprise SaaS doesn't work in China because there's a tendency of companies building its own. Now with generative AI, like let's say think GLM 5.2 from Zhipu, right? Is as good as what claims to be as good as what Faber can do. That means that more people would be able to build out their own software without the reliance of that. That should have also increased their token usage. And plus, of course, US companies are quietly not admitting it, but they are all routing to Chinese models as well, right? They do have a significant user base from that point of view. So it really kind of, sometimes China to me is a big paradox because I find that they are probably going to dominate the models despite how good the frontier models are for Anthropic and OpenAI. I wouldn't be even guilty to say that I route to all the models. First, I will try everything on Anthropic and OpenAI and they get good results. And if things are just as good in the Chinese AI, I will just route the task to the Chinese AI because of 1/10 of the cost. So it does really make it very, very strange to me why they are also focusing. I mean, I can understand why they're focusing on consumer, but I see products like Kimi, I see stuff from Moonshot and a couple of other Chinese AI companies because I see their use in my part of the world, the Southeast Asia. So I find it actually quite strange that the willingness to pay is still not there, given such high usage on there.
Yeah, it's not just that Chinese companies want to like to build on their own. It's also that they are super price sensitive. That the worst customers, whenever you get a cheaper option, they immediately go. There's no loyalty,
Yeah.
right?
But that's the same with all other rest of Asia customers too. So if
Yeah,
you're saying
very,
exactly that to
yeah.
me, I will tell you if you're in Southeast Asia, that's the same situation here too.
Yeah, so I wonder, maybe you could investigate and tell me what you find out since you are also a startup founder yourself. Because I think, at some point I thought it's because, enterprise, SaaS is still too commoditized. Product A that charges 10% more than product B is not really 10% better than product B. But then now in the AI, era, that didn't seem to be the case anymore, right? The technology, is, some of the models are much better than the others. But anyway, going back to the second thing I wanted to talk about the valuation, which is why, you asked me how things are different in China,
Yeah.
is another common sort of difficulty facing all the Chinese AI labs is the lack of compute. And so combined with, the much less like a prospect, much less lucrative prospect on the customer end, and also this huge constraint of compute on the supply end. That's why I think collectively you see the valuation so much lower. And then this is something that people outside China may not necessarily fully appreciate. And in terms of the lack of compute, this also has really limited the possibilities for Chinese neolabs, right? You asked me earlier about, Lin Zhiyang's neolab. I mean, if you look at what the US neolabs are doing, they do have sort of some of them, right? I mean, it's up to them what they want to do, but at least they are, from the day when they are born, they are not facing, lack of compute. And for neolabs, it's like from day one in China that they immediately have to think about where do I get compute. And for new labs or any startups in the US, if I fail, at least I can, my goal would be to try to get acquired by a big, tech giant. But in China, that's also very much, much harder. So basically, on one hand, you are building with substantially weaker infrastructure and supply, and on the other hand, your end, the exit, it also looks a lot more challenging for you. I mean,
Yeah, but
look at
then the energy and the energy and the infrastructure part they
energy,
can build faster. What they are lacking is the only
the
constraint,
chips.
which is the chips, right?
Yeah, that's what I meant by the lack of compute, right?
If I may just ask, right? So, like for example, the only thing that constrains China now is chips. And I think as of today, I remember I see the information headline this morning in my newsletter that I think Chinese government's going to allow them to purchase NVIDIA H200 chips, right?
100.
Yeah. So they
This
have
is
the energy.
6 months.
Yeah, they have the building data center infrastructure, definitely more sophisticated than what the US have. US, on the other hand, is having the frontier labs in the software side and very, very good chip designs, but they are lacking in energy and infrastructure. It's almost like they have each other's strengths, and where they're limited is where the difference are between them. Do I read this correctly, or is it just that things are in this way? That is also advantageous for the Chinese ecosystem, that maybe they could figure out a way to leapfrog at some point, because you can only throw how many algorithms to the problem, and most of these algorithms, state of the art, are actually quite publicly known among the AI researchers themselves, or where they're going.
Yeah, I mean the leapfrog thing, it has always been there. Like, if entire, Chinese engineers along the AI stack being pushed to a corner, then you just have to innovate. And then that's been proven the case with DeepSeek last year. But I think on the chip front, we still haven't seen it. And because and I think it's because of the constraint in the manufacturing equipment. You can engineer your way out of having, I mean, for example, if you look at Huawei recently with their new, law of Tau, which they can achieve the efficiency without the UV machine and all that,
That's right.
right? But that doesn't mean that they don't need other types of advanced manufacturing equipment that are still that's also under export restriction. So when you are talking about the hardware, it is a lot harder to have that leap for a moment, exactly because of this.
I want to talk about something else in the latest DeepSeek round about this unusual structure. So one interesting thing is that only a state-linked fund who invested directly have voting rights. How should we be reading this kind of funding structure? Is it now you can see this as a kind of the conventional startup financing, strategic ecosystem building, or maybe something that's distinctive to China's AI market? I always say something like, fundraising with Chinese characteristics. Government state capital is also involved as well.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't. I think the fact that the National AI Fund can invest in a company directly is because the government fund, comes with their own, like, you can think it this way, as they have even stricter compliance. So that's why they cannot follow, the LP structure. They have to put their money, because it's essentially, taxpayers' money, right, into the company itself. I wouldn't. You can say yes that the national fund, the government backed fund in the round gets a special treatment, but the reason for that special treatment is not because the government fund or the officials just muscle their way into DeepSeek office and say, "Hey, I'm not going to follow this." That's not why. What
Yeah,
happens
there's
is that
this big misconception from the US side. That's what they
exactly.
think.
That's why I want to
Yeah.
talk about this. It's because the government-backed fund, essentially, public money, fiscal money, taxpayer money, have to follow a set of much stricter compliance rules.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the government's auditor will not let this pass, right? You tell me that this, 1 billion yuan is invested in DeepSeek, but I don't see that's the case on paper, right? It seems like you invested in this guy instead, right? So that simply is. But then when you look at, the Tencent or the VCs, it's private enterprises, private investment funds. They have much more discretion in or flexibility in sort of participating or in a sort of less conventional structure. Yeah.
I'm glad you actually talk about this because I have been like trying to explain to people that it's not like the way they think the American media is putting that perception through. But I want to get to the another side of it because Liang invested quite a lot of his own money inside. What does that also tell us about founder power now in China's AI sector? What I'm alluding to is how does now founder control works differently when a company is operating in a field where investors, industry players, and policymakers all see this as strategically important. I mean, no guesses here, right? When I think Kertier lost the match to AlphaGo, that was the sparking moment for China's AI development as well.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I don't have to be the one telling you this, right? When you talk about funder control, like funders of big startups, superstar startup companies in China has a very difficult tightrope to walk, right? Including in Liang's case and many others before him, right? You really are not only the one calling all the shots, right? You have to be as you get bigger, then you will inevitably your orbit will inevitably be pulled closer to the central government. You may have to do things that you don't necessarily want to do or prioritize things not necessarily strictly to the order that you want. Then you just have to walk this really fine line. That's I think the one thing that makes it very different. But then we also see increasingly, I guess, in the US, with this contentious relationship at times, right? For example, between the White House and Anthropic, things are also and also OpenAI, right? OpenAI wasn't allowed initially to release GPT 5.6 to public. So I guess this is probably a era that funder control is getting less pure. It's getting more complicated. That there's more fingers in the pie than previously, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so I actually wanted to also spend a little time to think about the other story, which is Junyang Lin, who is the former Alibaba coin leader, who's seeking like 2 billion valuation at a point for his AI lab, and I think now he has already raised it. Does this actually also give us any indicator about the scarcity premium on elite AI researchers in China? I think he's the one who built the original coin models, for our audience understanding. Yeah.
Yeah, so his title when he was at Alibaba was the tech lead of Quince. That just to be specific, it was considered sort of instrumental in making Quinn really after DeepSeek probably the most
Yeah.
popular open source models. And he's also known as someone who really believes in the open source mission. I think this funding definitely shows the scarcity of elite researchers. And we see several companies being founded, I think, this year, all sort of fetching similar valuation in their like first round, like $1 billion or $2 billion. But I think it also shows a lot of FOMO by investors too, right?
Yeah, I guess FOMO happens everywhere, including China.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one interesting thing is you probably also know that now Alibaba's Quant models have now become one of China's strongest open source AI efforts, right? So one of the things that has been talked about a lot is that his departure was actually followed because Alibaba is thinking of going towards proprietary AI products. How are you thinking in terms of, say, Chinese AI companies or maybe including the BAT now balancing this open source influence but with the need to build sustainable commercial models?
Yeah. So, I mean, we can see ByteDance as, I mean, I think with the exception of like some versions of C-Dance, and I mean, there are large language models that are not open source, right? I mean,
Yeah.
and I think definitely I would say this balance is like a much more acute for the smaller companies, right? Because within the BAT, they all have like cash cow businesses. They can afford to open source if they want to, right? And for them, open source also generate more user and then therefore more data and then make their models smarter. But I think it's the smaller like apps, especially the ones that have already gone public, Zhipu and MiniMax that are probably have to face this problem. If you look at Zhipu, so we also reported earlier this week that Zhipu is actually thinking of finding a partner to design its own like custom inference chip. which is something that, as you know, a lot of other companies are doing. But actually, if you look at Zhipu, when Zhipu and MiniMax, they went public within like I think 2 days, right? Zhipu was 2 days ahead. But that time, like back in December, when people were comparing these two companies, I think the overarching feeling I got or commentary I got was they think MiniMax is the better bet. That was what the sentiment at the time, and it has already shifted, and which is reflected in the diverging stock price trends between the two companies. And people were not optimistic about Zhipu back then. Is because like more than 80% of the revenue at the time came from what they call prime on-premise deployment. And these are basically largely one-off revenue, right? You go to a customer's data center, you help them install your model, and then bye bye. I won't see you for another 10 years.
But then you forgot there's also maintenance as well, and these models will get better. So there's actually what I call maintenance upfront cost that I think a lot of people don't think that they're very commoditized, but actually the on-prem market is a little bit more fluid than that. Yeah, I'm speaking as a practitioner dealing with on-prem side now. A lot of my clients are asking me, I have more clients talking to me on on-prem AI than less on cloud-based AI. Yeah.
That's very interesting because that's not the direction that Zhipu is traveling to right now. So if you look at what has happened since they gone public in the last 6 months, I mean they published the annual results of 2025, and you can see the clear direction of travel. They basically are trying to sell more cloud-based API access and trying to rely less on prime installation or deployment. And I don't know how I don't know in China if how much you can charge for maintenance, but what's interesting is that you see companies like Zhipu clearly, being now one of the leaders in open source AI model, also is trying to just generate more recurring revenue from cloud-based API access, right? That again is when the lack of compute problem emerges being a big bottleneck. I actually talked to a startup founder recently who's building some kind of agentic application, and his team traditionally prefer like an OpenAI and Anthropic models, but GLM 5.2's like recent explosion made them thinking of trying. But then he told me that they couldn't actually buy the access from Zhipu because it's running so short. Zhipu actually cannot supply the growing demand that is out there.
Yeah, and it's still not actually, GM 5.2 is still not on any of the major cloud providers in the US side. Case in point, like Amazon Bedrock or the other parts as well. But I have one more question, which I thought would be getting your sense of it, because you look across today, DeepSeek, Zhipu or Z.ai, Quen, MiniMax, Moonshot, Kling, Menace. What is the best mental map for you when you look at China's AI ecosystem? Is it useful to divide the market into foundation models, application companies, and infrastructure? That's the US way of thinking. Or do you need a much more Chinese specific framework?
That framework that you mentioned in the US definitely is one of the ways. Another one would be, the upstarts versus the tier one tech giants than the tier two tech giants. I mean, I would put Kuaishou / Kling on the tier two, right? So one thing I actually was going to say earlier is that I don't know about you, but I am actually really surprised that by now we still haven't seen actual serious consolidation happening. And how can this go on? You asked me about the need to balance commercial and open source, right? I mean, we've seen the US that's basically now is in terms of frontier models, it's just consolidated within 3 or 4 companies, right? Llama is pretty much out, I think. But in China, you still have BAT, and then the B here means ByteDance. I mean, not, and then I mean,
I feel
I don't
bad for
want to
Baidu, but yeah, they're also AI player too, according to
yeah,
the.
Baidu obviously is still in the race, right? It's just like if you look at just the language model, there's already the BAT, right? And then if you look at the video models, then
Only
there is
ByteDance.
also no, there's also BAT
Oh,
plus yeah, no, Alibaba and Tencent also have their own video models too.
okay.
And Tencent's video model is actually not that bad because they have a lot of applications in gaming,
That's right.
right? So then in the video model, there's also VAT, and then there is clean, and then there is also some startups. But let's go to the startups. On the startup side, on the language model, there is four serious ones, right? AI and MiniMax, Moonshot, and the
DeepSeek.
DeepSeek.
Yeah.
Okay, and on the video models, so there is Pixelworks and Shenshu and a bunch of others. I don't know. I just can't imagine this being going on. I mean, I think after like Kaifu Lee's, 01 sort of essentially got folded into Alibaba, people thought that the consolidation is going to happen, but that was over a year ago. We still haven't seen that happening. And then now it looks like that, Moonshot is also preparing for an IPO likely next year. And DeepSeek is definitely going to stay here. So then basically within language model, we have already like 7 to 8 like serious players that are still in the race and no one wants to give up.
Wow.
I think that's pretty interesting.
So what you're alluding to is that probably in the next 6 to 12 months, that if there is some activity happening in the consolidation, then something is happening to the ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see any trends emerging right now that could lead to consolidation. I can tell you that I have reporting. I mean, I never wrote about this, but I did have reporting that, say 18 months ago, 24 months ago, there's one of the BATs wants to buy one of the other four companies that I was talking about. Okay. And the deal didn't happen because the price was considered by the to be bought company. So this shows you why I think the big reason why the consolidation hasn't happened. I mean, when you look at how many companies that SpaceX and or the other, or I mean Nvidia and all the others have bought, right? It's very different. Even though the valuation here in China is already considered a lot cheaper, the willingness to acquire a company at a slight premium is still not there. Yeah.
So since we just have a little bit limited time left, I only have two more questions before we close the thing. What is the one thing that you wish more people would ask you about the Chinese AI ecosystem that they don't? Or misconception that they... I think the misconception we have identified, but what's the one thing that you wish that more people would ask you about the Chinese internet ecosystem?
I'll use an example to answer that question. I think until our story came out, there was a lot of, including myself, like we reported and others too, that DeepSeek had spent a lot of time last year retrofitting their models and software with Huawei chips, which is what caused sort of I wouldn't call it a delay because they never said have a target, but which is what caused them to take so long to release before. But and then I think a lot of people assumed it's because the government ordered DeepSeek to work with Huawei to embrace the domestic ecosystem. But what we reviewed with the latest story is actually the opposite direction. It was DeepSeek that voluntarily started using Huawei, experimenting with Huawei chips. And Huawei actually only found out after that. And then they started sending people to DeepSeek to help them. So this is one of the things that really like surprised me when I was working on this story. And why did Liang want to do this? Because he believes, the so-called AI stack cannot just be, you cannot just have like say one like NVIDIA dominated AI stack. There should be more. There should be room for more. And he wants to play his part in sort of like charting a different ecosystem or different path alongside the NVIDIA dominated order. And then what this tells you is that even myself could sometimes have some kind of misconception when it comes to the relationship between the government and the regulators and the companies and the founders. One thing I will point out is that we and others also reported that the National AI Fund was going to invest in a much bigger amount in DeepSeek. But it turned out that I think at one point there was one article, not us, but some other outlet reported that actually this National AI Fund was going to be one of the like lead investors around. Now that the jury is out, we see actually the National AI Fund wrote the smallest check. What does that tell you? It tells you that it's not like the government can just waltz in and then do whatever they want, right? And it's also not that this, frontier models like DeepSeek, it's not like they resist. It's not like if they are collaborating with domestic AI stacks, not because they are necessarily told to do, it's because they actually see the need to do that for the longer term, like the survivability, the sustainability of China's AI development, you know? So that's something I think, yeah, I want to do.
That is a great insight. I think this is some of the things that a lot of people don't realize. That my final traditional closing question, and I'm going to phrase it this time differently. We're going to have the next 6 months all the way to 2027. What are the key indicators you will be watching? No need to predict this time. We are not in the prediction zone anymore because anything can come out almost the next week, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
what will be the things you look at? Is it model releases? Is it the chip adaptation? Is it the funding rounds? Is it the IPOs, or is it the regulation, or maybe developer adoption or talent movement? Any one of those.
Can I say
What? Yeah. What would you be watching out most for? Yeah.
Yeah, I think a talent is just definitely one of them, the direction of travel by top talent. I don't know if you noticed this, but there's also this trend of academic talent, like ethnic or Chinese born researchers working in the big US companies,
Yeah.
or
Moving back to
now
China.
a lot of them are in Hong Kong, you
Okay.
know, a lot of them have come to Hong Kong. Yeah, that's one thing to watch. And then the other would be, yes, I think on the chip front would be, really, I mean, supposedly Huawei's Ascend 960 coming out next year would have a capability on par with H200, but then I think that's something we definitely need to watch for. And I think one thing I would also want to know is really sort of the popularity, like can Chinese models sustain the popularity in the open source world? Because one of the things we haven't talked about, but maybe we can use this as a forward-looking ending. I'm sure you've seen that Anthropic had this sort of like geolocation tracking code in their software, and the Chinese government came out and say, you guys have to be aware of this security risks from cloud, and then you should try to uninstall all of that. And Alibaba was the first one, right, to tell all of the employees to uninstall this from your computer and everything. So if that's the case, if more Chinese AI model makers are uninstalling Claude, and if that were to continue, what will happen? Because so far, let's just say that distillation is very commonplace, and which is why you see Chinese open source models are always like playing catch up. It's always, whether you say it's a 1 month distance, 3 months, or 6 months. But because you rely to some extent, at least, distilling from the best model, that means you can never overtake the best, right? And if Chinese government can really order or strongly discourage all the model makers to not use Claude and Claude Code anymore, what will happen to the model development in the next 6 months? I'm very curious about that.
Right. So you think that I actually have a slightly different take. I think being an academic, and I've actually read the original DeepSeek paper myself, I find that one of the most under-talked discussion points on the Chinese AI models is that the Chinese AI models are pretty capable of building their own AI algorithms. And I think this is very underappreciated in the US, who keeps having the perception that they're being not innovative and distilling from them. Because I think one of the biggest advances in the last 3 years is in reinforcement learning. That's why your AI model seems to be getting better. And part of it was because it was the DeepSeek team that generalizes the reinforcement learning formulas so that the rest can use. So if they can make that kind of algorithmic purpose. In fact, I saw a pretty interesting paper by DeepSeek early this year about optimization across different network paths as well. It was quite surprising because one of the formulas they used was a Russian math formula that is pretty unknown to. And the reason why was because there was research collaborations between Russia and China. So they were aware of this kind of algorithmic advances on there. So I kind of not, what I think is really the limiting factor now is the chip. If that is a problem they can circumvent, given the circumstance, I think that there is still a leapfrogging path on it. I think that was a surprise when DeepSeek came out. And I thought this would be a much more optimistic way of looking at this conversation.
Well, actually, what you said and what I said can totally coexist because I cannot name any names because I don't want to get into trouble. But if you have friends working in any of these models we talked about and you ask them to do this, so from Anthropic OpenAI, you will know what I'm talking about.
I know what you're talking about.
And
I do know some of them. So yeah,
I'm sure you do.
And we were
Yes.
used to be colleagues in research in machine learning before. So I know what you're talking about from that point of view. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, Jim, many thanks for coming on the show. I'm going to quickly ask you any recommendations, book that you enjoy reading recently?
Not AI related though. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. I think people like all the other recommendations you do.
The last book I just finished reading, which was last week, is You Must Know Enwu Wang. I only know about him recently because I visited Penang for the second time in May. I really like it there. I like the whole Xi'an history, and I like how the Chinese culture and traditions were preserved so well in that part of Southeast Asia. So then I picked up a few books from this little bookstore in Penang, and one of them is Gan Wang's memoir called Home Is Not Here. And in the book, he detailed how he, grew up in APOC, Indonesia, and Malaysia, and also how he briefly studied in the Nanjing Central University right before, the Civil War expanded to Nanjing. And also in the book, he included like diaries he translated into English from his mother, talking about how when the World War II spread it to Southeast Asia, they were like fearing for their lives and how the sentiment changed in Southeast Asia as well. It's a really good read. I like reading like history books that are told from like
A different perspective.
from a very personalized
Yeah,
perspective.
I see. So where can my audience find you, the information? That's where I read my articles these days.
Yeah, so I'm on X or Twitter, Jing Yang, HK, and also jing@theinformation.com is my email address. And I'm on LinkedIn.
Definitely can find us anywhere. So Jing, many thanks for coming on the show. We'll talk again. Maybe either I come to Hong Kong or you come by Singapore again.
Yes, let's do that. Thank you.